Hi, and welcome to Hayden's Haunts. There is nothing like walking through a cemetery to get your Halloween spirit going. So today I'm giving some plastic tombstones a makeover. First, I'll fill in the parts of texture and smooth out some of the rough edges. Then, we're going to give them a coat of Drylok, followed up by some painting with washes and dry brushing. And to give our tombstones the final touch, I'm going to paint on some rotting moss. As Halloween is coming upon us, I really wanted to make a little graveyard to liven up my front yard for the spooky season. So, of course, I turned to the internet for inspiration. There are a lot of haunters out there who have done an amazing job at making tombstones from scratch, as well as giving pre-made ones a good makeover. The only thing is, all the videos I've seen are all about foam tombstones. I really wanted to make something a bit more robust, and I didn't really want to make something out of foam only to have it snap in half before the next season. So I headed to the nearest hardware store and picked up some plastic gravestones. If you have never been to or seen pictures of the Highgate Cemetery in London, you should pause this video and Google it right now. Those Victorians really knew how to do cemeteries right. The tall columns, weeping angels, urns draped in stone cloth, crosses carved with amazing detail are just so captivating. Plus, with the many years of aging and nature taking over, those moss and vine-covered memorials just make the most hauntingly beautiful scenery to look at. One of these days, I hope to visit the Highgate in person, but until then, I'll just have to be happy with making a mini version in my front yard. So off I ran to a few stores to pick up some wooden appliques to give my tombstones a fancy Victorian flair. I was also super excited to find some stone-looking angels at Home Depot, and even more excited that I wouldn't have to make a tombstone angel from scratch. I also picked up some Drylok and a chipped brush from the hardware store, and also I happened to have some acrylic paint and a squirt bottle at home. Because all these tombstones are made from plastic blow molds, they all had a bit of a plastic seam running around their edges. So I grabbed a knife and carefully carved away at the bits that were standing out a little more than I liked. After the fact, my husband pointed out that I could have just used a Dremel tool, so if you have one, use it. If not, you'll do just fine with a knife. But to be honest, this step isn't really necessary, so feel free to skip it. I don't show a video clip, but before I did anything else, I went over each tombstone to find any textured holes that were a little deeper than I liked, and I filled them with hot glue. After that, I took the wooden appliques and super glued and hot glued them to the backside of each tombstone. I didn't want anything falling off, so I just went all the way by using two types of glue. I should mention that the front of the stones looked great, but since I really wanted to add a Victorian feel to my graveyard, I decided to use the somewhat blank backsides of the tombstones. After the glue was dry, it was time to add some stone-like texture to the plastic-looking gravestones. So I mixed some black acrylic paint with white Drylok to get a base gray color. Then, using a chip brush, I painted on the Drylok. Not only did it give the stones some great texture, it also sealed up the wooden pieces that I had just glued on. Just as a side note, I used 1 quart of Drylok to cover the 2 angels, the tall tombstone, and the small tombstone. Since the cross already had good color and is made of plaster, I didn't really need to add a layer of Drylok. Next, I designed what the epitaphs would say and what they would look like. Since the larger stone had a lot more blank space underneath the name, I looked up a Victorian poem to give the epitaph a little more realistic look. Then for the smaller one, I found a design and changed it a little bit. Then I cut the designs out of cardstock using a vinyl cutter. Usually I would want to use a sticky-sided vinyl for this, but because there was already texture on the gravestones plus the Drylok, there was no way I was going to be able to get anything to stick to them. So I just held the stencils in place with my hand while I used acrylic paint and a sponge brush to go over the words. Because of all the texture, the lettering didn't really come out super clear, so I had to go over it by hand with a smaller paintbrush. The epitaph didn't end up being super crisp and clear, but I felt that it was okay because these are supposed to be old and falling apart. When the epitaphs were dried, I mixed together some acrylic paints with water to make a wash. I used mainly brown and black for the base colors, and then later on added a bit of green to make it look like moss was just creeping all over the tombstones. But before I started to paint, I sprayed them over with some water so that when I applied the wash, it would seem as if years of dirt and dead moss and rain had made the tombstones look really, really old and dirty. I tried to fill in the cracks with thicker paint so that really helped them pop. Between spraying water and applying the wash, I was able to get the tombstones looking wonderfully spooky. At this point, you could do some dry brushing on some of the high points of the wood appliques and the tops of the tombstones, but I really liked how they looked, so I didn't worry about it. But I did want to add some moss, so I did a similar technique to how I painted the rest of the tombstone, but this time, after letting the green paint spread a little bit, I mixed a little bit of brown paint and a little bit of green without adding water to keep a thicker consistency. Then I used an old paintbrush and dabbed some random splotches of paint in the crevices of the appliques and the bases of the tombstones. You could glue moss on that you could buy at the craft store, but I didn't want it attracting bugs or falling off before next Halloween season. After putting the gravestones in the sun to dry, I finally got to set up my mini Victorian graveyard in my own front yard. I also stuck some color-changing solar lights just a few feet in front of each of the stones. Originally, I was going to set the colors to be blue and green, but after watching the lights change a couple times, I thought it looked pretty neat, so I kept it that way. And there you have it, a spooktacular graveyard. Have a happy haunting!